afternoon. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this symposium on the Garfield-AF study on behalf of myself, AJ Kakkar from London, and Jean-Pierre Basson from France. It's our very great pleasure to welcome you to this meeting. I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of background to the Garfield study and where we have got to over the past 8 or 9 years as a substantial global collaboration. I should say at the outset that the Garfield-AF Registry has been funded through an unrestricted grant from Bay AG and conducted as an academic study through an independent steering committee coordinated by the Thrombosis Research Institute in London. And Garfield has been quite unique in that at this moment in time it remains the largest prospective atrial fibrillation registry. It's been conducted in newly diagnosed patients presenting with atrial fibrillation in 35 countries around the world, where some 1,300 sites have been randomly selected, representing different settings for the management of the care of atrial fibrillation patients, both the hospital setting, specialist setting, and the primary care community setting. We've been able to recruit some 57,000 patients as part of this collaboration in 5 sequential cohorts, and the early cohorts clearly have a longer follow-up than the later. All patients had the opportunity for a minimum of 2 years of follow-up, and some have been followed up for 8 years. So a very substantial body of evidence available for us to subject to analysis and draw insights from this type of outcomes registry study, which might complement the vitally important findings that we already have from the large pivotal phase 3 programs that have been published in recent years. And the first patient went into the Garfield-AF registry in cohort 1 at the end of 2009. And subsequent to that, we have had opportunities to focus on certain areas, some of which I'm going to present in this talk, and others which will be focused on in terms of the most recent analyses by my colleagues in this symposium. But we've been able to look at, for instance, the changing patterns of practice around the world as the innovations in anticoagulation that represent the thrombin inhibitors and the 10A inhibitors have become more routinely available in clinical practice. This isn't a drug registry, this is a disease burden registry. So we've been able to look in some detail at the burden of disease. The entry criteria into the Garfield registry were that patients were newly diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, irrespective of what their risk score may be, irrespective of how they were being managed, whether they received anticoagulant therapy, antithrombotic therapy, or not. Because it's a global registry conducted in 35 countries, we've been able to look at the global variation in management of patients, and now as we have a mature database and are looking at outcomes, how outcomes differ in different parts of the world, in different healthcare systems, and in different health economies. We've been able to establish a new risk model for atrial fibrillation, which combines the opportunity to look at the risk for death, for stroke, and for bleeding in a single model at the time of presentation with atrial fibrillation, a very important opportunity to start focusing colleagues' attention to these important risks for poor clinical outcome in AF patients. In 2016, we completed enrollment of the 57,000 patients, and we're now moving into developing and testing methodology which will allow us to make some sense of comparative effectiveness, something which is principally and rightly determined in a randomized trial, but where we need to be able to draw some conclusions from patients who would not normally be included in randomized trials because of their extensive comorbidities, but where we as clinicians want to have an understanding that extrapolating from what's been seen in clinical trials of innovations in therapy is entirely appropriate in the broader population of patients that are not included. And as we move forward, we now have the opportunity to start evaluating the patient-reported outcomes that have been included in the evaluation as part of this ongoing registry, and to start looking at questions of outcomes as atrial fibrillation starts to mature in its natural history and the different interactions of comorbidities and how they might influence clinical outcome. So as I said, this is a global registry. You can see here in blue the countries that participated. Clearly, in any global study, there are missing areas in the world, but as best possible that the investigators could, we've brought together a group that represents an important proportion of global disease burden. One of the most important early areas of focus in the Garfield study was to look at the question of the quality of data. And Professor Keith Fox from Edinburgh led the audit committee for the Garfield programme and was able to publish in the European Heart Journal Quality, Care and Clinical Outcomes last year the first 4 cycles of audit that were undertaken globally in the Garfield programme. And as you can see here, a very strong concordance between source data, because there was source data verification, and data entered into the electronic database by participating clinicians. A very important first step in ensuring that high data quality was being maintained across the globe in this study so that we could be more certain about the analyses that we undertook. By having 5 sequential cohorts, the a priori design for the Garfield programme, we've been able to track over time trends in terms of the utilization of baseline anticoagulant prescribing. You can see those summarized here from cohort 1 on the left to cohort 5 on the right. And what one can see here is that in the first cohort, recruited predominantly in 2010 and 11, that 57.4% of patients were anticoagulated. The blue here, a vitamin K antagonist, plus or minus antiplatelet therapy. The red, one of the novel oral anticoagulants, plus or minus anticoagulant therapy. And you can see that only a tiny proportion of patients in that first cohort were receiving one of the NOACs. The majority who were anticoagulated received a vitamin K antagonist. What was striking in a global population of newly diagnosed AF, where clinicians entering patients into the registry felt that patients were at risk of stroke, that only 57% of them were receiving some form of anticoagulation as they presented. If you look at cohort 5, that situation has improved to 71% of patients at presentation being started on anticoagulant. You can see here a greater proportion of patients now receiving the NOACs, some 43%, and the reduction in use of vitamin K antagonists. And interestingly, you can see the green here, antiplatelet therapy alone. What's striking when you look across the globe is that 10% of patients presenting with AF considered to be at risk of stroke still do not receive any form of intervention, be it anticoagulant or antithrombotic therapy. There's a broad variation, and you can see here across participating countries the difference in red, blue, green, and purple, representing different utilization of NOACs, the red, the blue, vitamin K antagonists, the green, antiplatelet therapy alone, and the purple, no intervention. So again, in a global registry, the opportunity to look at practice patterns across the world. Because we had such a large number of patients with vitamin K antagonists as their principal intervention for preventing stroke, one can see over here the early analyses from these studies published by Professor Sylvia Haas and colleagues that demonstrated that a failure to achieve the appropriate time in therapeutic range, less than 65% of INRs, resulted in a higher risk for stroke, a higher risk for major bleeding, and a higher mortality. So that the reality is, if we're going to provide vitamin K antagonists to our patients, in the setting outside the randomized trial, we see the importance of achieving an appropriate INR control. Professor Bassan and colleagues led an analysis looking at outcomes at 2 years in the early cohorts of this study. And in that publication, in the European Heart Journal, we're able to demonstrate that the greatest burden for patients newly presenting with atrial fibrillation is actually the risk of dying, and that early death risk attends the earliest phase after presentation, greatest in the first month and in the subsequent 3 months after presentation with atrial fibrillation. Strikingly, the distribution of death in patients newly presenting with atrial fibrillation is between cardiovascular mortality and non-cardiovascular deaths, and you can see over here how cardiovascular death alters over time in those time periods, but non-cardiovascular death risk is maintained equally across the entire 2-year follow-up period. And it is the comorbidities that are, of course, driving this poor clinical outcome in patients with atrial fibrillation. Again, from the paper by Professor Bassond, demonstrating how the different comorbidities in unselected, consecutively presenting, newly diagnosed AF patients drive poor clinical outcome, suggesting that a more holistic approach, integrating care for both comorbidities and the opportunity to prevent stroke with an anticoagulant, represents the best opportunity for improving outcomes in our patients. And then, of course, we have the very interesting analysis, because of the global nature of the study, that allows us to look at the variation in clinical outcome, be it all-cause mortality, stroke, or major bleeding, across 35 countries in the world. Here, using methodology to ensure that the comorbidities are properly represented and allowed for in the analysis, you can see that there is a broad variation in clinical outcome for those 3 endpoints across the globe. What's striking is that there is a variation in each outcome. So countries that might do badly in terms of all-cause mortality don't necessarily do badly in terms of bleeding or stroke. A very interesting observation, which is the subject of further investigation. And as I said, we have also the GARFIELD risk tool published by Professor Fox and colleagues in BMJ Open in 2017, where the risk model established by using the GARFIELD population, some 40,000 patients newly diagnosed with atrial fibrillation and prospectively followed, was compared to the CHADS-VASc or HASBLED for bleeding in both that population and in subsequently a further validation in the ORBIT registry. And what you can see here is the GARFIELD risk model compared to CHADS-VASc for all-cause mortality and ischemic stroke does better than CHADS-VASc in both of those endpoints, and when compared to major bleeding, performs as well as the HASBLED score. This, as I say, was published with the validation against the ORBIT registry in BMJ Open in 2017. So that's some of the work that's come out of the GARFIELD study to date. Today we want to look at 4 broad areas: clinical effectiveness of oral anticoagulants in routine care, the treatment of patients with atrial fibrillation across the world in the NOAC area, and then look at the impact of discontinuation and non-recommended dosing of NOACs for clinical outcome in unselected patients presenting with newly diagnosed atrial fibrillation, and then look at the change in prescribing practice and the impact on outcomes that have been achieved.